Hi everyone, I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about lab change. And for lab this week, we are going to talk a lot about the carbon cycle. So back a few weeks ago when we were discussing the biogeochemical cycles, one of the important cycles was carbon. And we learned a little bit about where we find carbon, right? We talked about carbon in the atmosphere, we talked about carbon in the living things, we talked about carbon in the ground, carbon in the oceans. So now that we understand a little bit more about climate change, and one of the leading causes of climate change being those increased carbon emissions, right? So we're taking carbon that used to be locked up in the ground in the form of fossil fuels like coal and oil and gas, and as we burn them, it takes that ground carbon and turns it into atmospheric carbon. And of course, we know that carbon is a greenhouse gas. And so the more carbon we have in the atmosphere, it acts like a warming blanket and it traps more heat here on planet Earth. So in this week's lab, what we're going to be doing is we're going to sort of play around with a carbon simulator. So in this case, we're going to look at a computer model that has been created that estimates what happens to carbon as we move it from one place to another. So as we're moving it from the ground and then moving it into the air, and where else does it move to? So it doesn't just go to the atmosphere, right? It also ends up in oceans, it ends up in living things. So we're going to kind of track carbon, and we're going to see what other human activities can impact this carbon cycle. So what are other ways that we can increase or reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere? So for lab this week, there is a link to the carbon simulator itself right here in the lab, and that you'll notice in this week's lab we have several different scenarios basically that we're going to run through. And in each case you're going to be collecting data, and that data you're going to put into these different tables based on the parameters of the carbon simulator. So I'm going to take you and show you the carbon simulator right here. So when you open the carbon simulator, this is what it looks like. Please make sure when you are reading the lab that you make sure that you've got the settings specifically the way that the lab is asking for them. So for example, in the first simulation we're going to run, we want to make sure that the carbon cycle is highlighted at the top of the screen. So coming back to our simulator here, it does say the carbon cycle, so we're good to go. In order to run the simulation, and actually I'm going to move my little video guy. Where do I want to move me? I'm going to move me someplace where I'm a little less, there we go. I'm going to move me out of the way so that you can see this. This is what I want you to see. So you can adjust parameters of the simulation here, and then what you're recording these numbers here. So each of these little gray rectangles represent 25 gigatons of carbon. So what you'll see is that we're taking carbon that was once locked up here deep in the ground in the form of coal and oil and gas, and as we burn it, we're seeing that carbon move through different parts of the environment. So for example, in the very first simulation, we're going to assume that we're increasing fossil fuel consumption by 2.5% per year, which has been what we've seen sort of as a historical average. We increase the amount of fossil fuels we use about 2.5% per year. And then we're going to run this per decade. So first, we're going to write down these numbers in 2010. It says year 2010, and we're going to write down all of these numbers first here. So coming back once more to our lab, here's the year 2010. So I would write down the number for smokestacks, atmosphere, ocean, surface, deep ocean, so on and so forth. And then once again, remember that those tell you, sort of those things are right here, right? So we have the atmosphere, 720, terrestrial plants, 700, coal, oil, gas, all of those types of things, right? So we're going to hit run decade, okay? And as we run the decade, you can see that the numbers have changed, right? So we're increasing the amount of carbon in certain parts of the simulation and then decreasing it in other places, right? As we burn solid carbon and liquid carbon that's here, we turn it into other forms of carbon. So you'll just keep hitting this run decade button, okay? And every year you stop and you write down the new numbers. I put this in the lab, but just as a note for atmosphere, please don't record the parts per million concentration. What we want is the total gigatons, which is the number that's right next to the word atmosphere. Okay, so again, you keep running this and you keep watching the numbers change. Okay, we ran out of oil and gas, by the way, right around 2050, if you didn't notice that, but we still have tons and tons of coal, and just we keep going, right, till you get to the year 2100. So in the first part of the lab, you will just fill out all of this information. Okay, so then you're going to run the simulation again, but you're going to change some parameters. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to see what happens if we had no carbon emissions whatsoever. So if we ran this simulation and we ran it to none, we click the none button, so let's hit reset, and we had none, no carbon emissions whatsoever, you're going to see something very different, right? Okay, so the way that carbon is moving through the ecosystem is a lot different when we're not burning fossil fuels. So you'll continue on with the lab. Again, please make sure that you just sort of follow the instructions that are in the lab for each scenario. You're going to be changing other things in the simulation as well. At one point, you're going to change the amount of deforestation that's occurring, and you're just going to see what that impact has on the carbon cycle. In another lesson, you're actually going to move to a different lesson. It's going to be called feedback effects, and you're going to put melt tundra, and you're going to change the rate at which you're melting the tundra. So you can melt 1/12 of the tundra, or you can melt 1/6 of the tundra, and you're going to see what that, oh, there goes my poster. You're going to see how that impacts the cycle as well. Okay, so again, all the instructions and all the information you need to run the simulation is here in your lab, but I just wanted to give you sort of a preview of what this simulator looks like. And of course, if you have any questions whatsoever, as always, please let me know, and we will, and I will address those as best as I can. That's it for today. Thanks, guys.